Hi everyone, Tracy DW here. For thousands of years, cocoa has been a central element to indigenous life in the Amazon basin and other parts of Central South America. Here, it had been cultivated and used for more than 2 millennia by the Mayans, who regarded the cocoa plant with reverence, declaring it a food of the gods, as well as a type of god's currency, where commodities could be bought and sold for cocoa nibs. After Christopher Columbus introduced cocoa to Spain and Portugal, it was not until a further 3 centuries later, in 1828, that the Dutchman Conrad van Houten invented the cocoa press, which extracted powder, making a smoother drink, from the cocoa butter. When this butter was combined with more cocoa powder and sugar, he was able to make the first chocolate. The ability to make chocolate tasting a pastime for the masses and not just exclusively an activity for the wealthy brought about a sudden and enormous demand throughout the 19th century. However, due to this high demand and a shortage of labour markets in South America, expansion of production spread to the Caribbean and eventually mainland Africa by the 1870s. Between 1911 and 1976, Ghana became the world's leading producer of cocoa, only second to the Ivory Coast, contributing up to 40% of the world's total output. In Ghana, cocoa farming has been the foundation for most family businesses and employment, as well as the staple commodity of the Ghanaian economy for more than a century. The cocoa trees are grown in cleared forested areas such as in Ashanti and Brong Ahafo and Volta, and although it is mass-produced by many peasant farmers, it has been monopolised by the powerful few. Due to cocoa being so central to Ghana's economy, the government took over control of the industry in the 1930s. First, under British colonial control, where in 1937, when Ghana was then known as the Gold Coast, farmers refused to be undersold with low buying prices from European merchants. They withheld selling for 8 months until the Noel Commission inquiry by the UK advised the government to form a marketing board. This first took the form of the West African Control Board from 1940 to 1947, the Cocoa Marketing Board from 1947 to 79, seeing through to Ghana's independence in 1957, and now, as it is known today as the Ghana Cocoa Board. The Ghana Cocoa Board has brought in much reform to the industry, as dwindling production during the 1960s and 70s due to ageing trees, disease, bad weather and bushfires were combined with low prices. Reform came in providing seedlings to replace old trees, clearing additional forest land for planting and upgrading roads to expand transport routes. In 1982, the Akuofa check system was introduced and went some way towards addressing the problem of falsified payments to hard-working farmers. In 1984, the board shifted more towards privatisation, removing subsidies and bringing in greater price and manufacturing regulations, which brought about mass unemployment, but still kept Ghana within the top 3 highest yielding countries for cocoa. Today, in the 2020s, Ghana has now been presented with a second opportunity for independence. The country's president, Nana Akufo-Addo, announced Ghana's intention to not only continue to secure price regulation and a premium called the living income differential to benefit farmers, but also make the transition from simply mass-producing the cocoa as a raw material to actually processing and manufacturing cocoa into more products, including chocolate. This is an obvious game changer, enabling an African nation to do what European markets have been doing for centuries, not only mass produce raw materials cheaply, but also have the potential to monopolise processing these raw materials into finished goods, allowing for a huge profit margin when selling the finished goods to other markets across the world. With the US being the highest importers of cocoa powder, the UK having the highest retail chocolate consumption, the Netherlands having the highest cocoa bean import, and Switzerland processing much of the world's luxury chocolate. This would potentially place Ghana as one of the world's leading producers within the chocolate factory. If Ghana is to achieve such an economic utopia, then what are the key issues that the country needs to overcome and address? Well, there are many issues to consider. Cocoa has a long production cycle that is sensitive to variants which are both labour and resource intensive. Hybrid varieties of beans need over 5 years to come into production, and trees need 10 to 15 years to reach their full bearing potential. Much of the population work within the cocoa industry and rely on it for their incomes. Therefore, government incentives and price regulation is really important in order for a living wage to be sustained. Together with high labour costs and low rainfall, deforestation is also a huge global issue, and the balance between clearing land for planting and regrowing and replenishing forest areas is a delicate one. The Cocoa and Forests Initiative, which was part of the UN Climate Change Conference in 2017, created an international agreement that no more forests would be converted for cocoa farming. Another major challenge is the use of child labour and its implications for trafficking, slave labour and child abuse. Around 2 million children have been engaged in cocoa farming using hazardous tools, dangerous chemicals, lifting and carrying heavy loads, and often working for up to 100 hours a week. Many have been subjected to harsh, brutal treatment and abuse. Historically, poverty and a lack of schooling has placed children firmly within the labour market as a cheap way to maximise productivity. And due to such high demand for chocolate and dependency on cocoa production in Ghana's economy, is it within the global community's interests to change things? Just as sugar was boycotted during the latter part of the 18th century in protest against slavery, how can we as consumers become more responsible? Over the past 2 decades, there has been a growing consciousness amongst manufacturers and consumers on the need to eradicate the use of child labour in cocoa farming. In the US, the Harkin-Engel Protocol was passed with the aim to eradicate child labour in cocoa farming by the end of 2005, producing a certification that manufacturers could use to verify that their produce was without the worst forms of child labour. An international cocoa initiative was also taken to safeguard the rights of children, as well as fair trade initiatives to aid prevention in the marginalisation of cocoa labourers in developing countries, forming an agricultural cooperation to ensure that fair payment is made to maintain both living and schooling costs. But what impact have these laws and initiatives had? And are farmers, labourers and children any better off? The targets for certification indicated by the Harkin-Engel Protocol were continually extended through 2008 to 2010, with the EU passing a resolution in 2012 with a deadline for all farmers and manufacturers of cocoa to meet the requirements for certification by 2020. A more recent study by the World Cocoa Organization reported that child labour had been reduced by 1/3, and government actions have enabled almost all children to be able to attend school in Ghana, and almost 80% of children are now attending schooling in the Ivory Coast. The study also stated that the 60% increase in productivity over the last few years has not been due to child labour. However, as with all research, the reality of the situation may be very different, and as usual, when looking at any kind of research, one must always question the evidence and the validity of the study. I began to explore the possibility of President Nana Akufo-Addo's vision for a chocolate factory in Ghana by examining this more closely through using the coaching model of a SWOT analysis in order to explore Ghana's prospects as strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. Firstly, its strengths. Almost 40% of the world's cocoa is grown in the country. No importation required for the raw materials. Secondly, its weaknesses. Chocolate is a heat-sensitive product which would require mass refrigeration at all times. This would have major implications for their grid, which is unreliable. There is little to no dairy farming in Ghana, and this is the potential threat. If they have to import large amounts of dairy, which is crucial to making chocolate, this would place Ghana at the mercy of global markets for dairy produce and could lower or wipe out their profit margins. How is dairy farming conducive to the wider African continent? And can Ghana negotiate with other neighbouring countries without going into European or American markets, which would place Ghana at a disadvantage as these countries would control the price? So what are the opportunities? Actually processing the cocoa beans and addressing issues in the power grid to ensure electricity cuts do not spoil or hinder the manufacturing and refrigeration process. Addressing this issue could greatly increase the current rate of productivity for cocoa butter, cocoa liqueur and other intermediate products that Ghana currently produces, and these could be used as a type of dry run to see how productivity could be increased and improved before applying this to their current output of chocolate, which at this moment accounts for just around 4% of their current total output. And since Ghana now has 5 times more processing plants than they did 10 years ago, there are definitely ways to build capacity in relation to processing cocoa into other forms for use and consumption. So, with all this in mind, is it possible for Ghana, as well as the Ivory Coast, to compete with the chocolatiers of Europe, to become one of, if not the leading, chocolate factories of the world? Is it possible to rival the Dutch, Swiss and the US? Will this be an opportunity seized or missed for the continent of Africa? Will Ghana one day have ownership of a capitalist process that not only produces the raw materials, but manufacturing, marketing and selling to global markets through means and a capacity to rival those of its former colonial masters? If you liked this podcast, then stay on this listening platform and check out my other podcast episodes related to this one, such as Looking Back in Anger, What's Next for Zimbabwe, all the way back in the 2nd season. And don't forget what I call the heart and soul of the Stories to be Told movement. My stories or poetic narratives, Caribbean Wind, Caribbean Rush, Nights at the Round Table, the Berlin Conference 1884 and Gone with the Wind, Macmillan's Speech for Change. They're all available on the website in both Kindle and paperback formats. Just check out the podcast notes for this particular episode. And also the publication of the latest 4 titles. To find out more, just visit storiestobetold.com and check out the learning platforms for The Journey's End, Giving Back Hong Kong, Bite from the Big Apple, A Story for New York, Hope for Zimbabwe, Arise the Phoenix, and A Story for South Africa. And why not check out the promotions page on the website, where you'll find more information about our free giveaways, and this month it's our logo t-shirt. Now, if you're not a part of the email list, what are you waiting for? Visit the website and sign up, where you can opt in and receive your free samples of my first 4 titles. It's the only way to enter the draw for a chance to win a giveaway. And you can also read our monthly newsletter here as well. And finally, remember that you can also send me an audio message on the SpeakPipe link, which is also in the show notes, so don't be a stranger, drop me a message. Feel free to like, follow and share us on social media when you visit the website. Just click on to whichever social media link you would like to follow us on. And as always, it is a pleasure and a privilege to share my learning journey with you in this podcast series, and I encourage you to either begin or continue your own. History is a matter of fact or perspective. I'm Tracy DW, and this is a Stories to be Told podcast. Stay safe, stay well, stay blessed. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you on the next